to the June 12th Government Operations Committee at 1 o'clock, City Hall, Room 301B, just in case we're watching and potentially want to come down here. And we'll welcome everybody to the room. And, okay, can I get a motion from our May 15th meeting minutes?
I'll move to approve.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, ayes have it. And we're going to move to our first agenda item, which is the public safety monitor function within the Office of Operational Analysis. Would you like to kick us off, Mr. Edwards?
Yes, Chair. I've got just 2 or 3 slide PowerPoint just to lay out the decisions before y'all. So as y'all know, I think in March at the GOC, our HR director came and shared some of HR's recommendations about the potential positions. And so what we wanted to do today, now that y'all have named and voted on auditor, that was what y'all wanted to do before we brought this back to the GOC. We wanted to bring this back before you and just remind you of kind of the different decision points in front of the GOC. So we go to the next slide. So in terms of kind of what we need from the GOC, what y'all need to talk about today, we do need a recommendation from the GOC of where to locate the responsibility, and y'all have talked about that previously. We need a recommendation on how to staff the responsibility, and then we need a recommendation on the personnel and operating funds to support the work. So if y'all are able to come up with that decision today, what we can do as staff is develop the GOC report in time for the next agenda cycle, which would be the July-August agenda cycle, the August vote. And so that will be 1 month in for the new auditor at that point. Next slide, please. So those are the 3 things. And I just want to remind you on what HR shared. So if y'all remember, you've been discussing, and the recommendations you've received have been to locate this responsibility in the Office of Operational Analysis. And so what HR did when they visited in March was they gave y'all 2 recommendations. So if you remember, there's an auditor position and there's 2 management analyst positions currently. And y'all just named the auditor. So there's 2 vacancies for the auditor to fill when they start. So what HR recommended was you could either do a couple of things. One, you could cross-train the management analysts to support in the PSCOB monitor functions. And there's 2 positions to do that. The second option is you can convert potentially one of those management analyst positions into an attorney 1, 2, or 3. So that was an option too. What y'all had said in March, I think, it was that meeting, you wanted to wait till you had filled the position and heard from the auditor. So there's a third option. Third option would be to add a position. So you could just add either an attorney 1 or a management analyst, and you'll see the costs up on the screen to do that for salary and benefits and a computer. You're talking, $70,000, $80,000 for a year. So those are the 3 options in terms of staffing if you decide to put it in operational analysis. So I just wanted to kind of present those and remind you all on those discussions we've had to this point.
Okay. And Mr. Hasselman has sent us an email, and unfortunately, when I forwarded it, the attachment didn't get forwarded, but there's a copy on the table. The last 3 paragraphs, the last 4 paragraphs, are the substance of his recommendation. His recommendation is for us to decide which department to go into, which and I think Office of Operational Analysis would be a great place for the PSCOB monitor position to be at. As well, he recommends a full-time monitor position comparable to the level associated with attorney or a management analyst classification in terms of pay grade. And how do we make a recommendation when it comes to budget? We just say,
I think what you would do is you would say, whether you want it to be an attorney or a management analyst, I think that's what your recommendation would be, the specific title. And then What HR is gonna have to do is go from there and grade the position. This is their best guess estimate, what that would be, depending on either if it's a 121 or a 119, that's what it's likely to be. But if you just say, you want it to be an attorney one position or an additional management analyst position to make 3, then HR will go do the rest. And then the GOC report will have lined out the exact amount of money. I just wanted you to know the general cost that it was going to be if it was a new position. And I think the only other thing I would add is Sherry might want to speak to the fact that it's not, so this position will be doing the work, but the actual auditor will be the one assigned the work. I don't know if you want to just.
Yeah, I have a couple of things. So just as that reminder, you certainly can change by ordinance the duties of the internal auditor because the charter refers to, it says that, that the duties of the internal auditor shall be set by ordinance, which they are. The issue is that you cannot create essentially like a sub office under the auditor because that would be changing the form of our government and would require a legislative act. So I mean, I guess I could say you could propose that change, but it would have to go through the legislature. It's not something that the mayor and commission could do on its own. And I think we all recognize how difficult that process might be. So I just want us to be very careful how we talk about it, that the internal auditor is the one who will be assigned these roles. The second thing that Attorney Drake wanted me to bring up is that as far as I'm aware, there is no circumstance in the government where we have an attorney position supervised by a non-attorney. Like all of our attorney 1, 2s, and 3s are all in either a prosecutorial office, our office, a judge's office. So it's not that we haven't had positions where an attorney and someone who's admitted to practice law in the state of Georgia has served in an administrative functions, thinking of, Deborah Longan, and Crystal, Coburn also had a law degree, but none of them served in an actual legal position. So I think we have a little just pause about creating an attorney 1 position, not only would it be being supervised by a non-attorney, but also that we want to make it clear that under the charter, the only person able to give legal guidance to the government is the attorney's office. So if you did create an attorney position, it would be really important to recognize that this person isn't there to provide legal guidance to PSCOB, isn't there to provide legal guidance to the auditor's office. That maybe that person served in an investigative function and that's why you want someone with some legal experience, but just making it really clear what that person's duties are. He also suggested that, it might be a situation where we'd really need to look at a classification study to determine what's appropriate, in terms of bringing in an attorney for that kind of role, just because it's very different from any other attorney roles that currently exist in the government. So I just wanted to share that from Attorney Drake since he couldn't be here.
Certainly complicated things.
It actually doesn't.
It really
Okay.
Because I think what we've been getting from PSCOB, they just asked for a monitor position. They didn't say it had to be an attorney or anything else, but they want a monitor position to be able to function to help them do their role. So if I'm in order, my recommendation would be that we go with another management analyst in the office of internal audit to work closely with PSCOB. One thing in the letter that Gavin sent to us was whenever we get the office up, probably all 3 of those people possible cross-train, possible. But it'd be somebody assigned to work with PSCOB and do an investigation within the public safety realms of Athens-Clarke County government. And that's a lot. Well, understand, but anyway, I'm just sort of throwing that out there.
And then the other option, you could do that, you could add it to it, or you could look at this in the budget process next year. So you could, since both of the current, if you're going to keep it a management analyst, there's 2 vacant management analysts now. What you could do is you could give the opportunity for the auditor to fill those positions and see if there's the need to ask y'all in the budget process next year for a 3rd management analyst, if you're going to keep it management analyst. That's the alternative to that.
Or once to get some staff, we could do a budget amendment in the middle of the year.
Good.
Yeah, I agree with Dexter. I don't think it's necessary that this be an attorney. Someone who definitely has some investigative experience. I think it might be better that it's not an attorney, someone who's able to work with this committee, without being overburdened by legal analysis. So I agree. And as far as like, having someone who's, I have mixed feelings about whether or not we have a dedicated monitor in the Office of Operational Analysis in addition to the two other positions. I think we need to have a broader discussion about that. It's yet to be seen like what kind of workload this person will have. But I mean, I know that they do already have kind of a backlog of issues they'd like to look into.
And also, Peace Corps, if they had legal questions, that would refer to y'all, or not necessarily y'all, but I mean.
That's right.
The attorney's office would, yeah, give the source of that.
Manager Edwards, does Peace Corps have a budget now?
No, so that's why the third bullet is, it's personnel, but also operating. So that it's a little more challenging when we have the Office of Operational Analysis, which has been vacant, positions have been vacant. They also have an operating budget that they haven't been using. And so, that's the other thing to think about is how much funds would we need to put into operational analysis to help support the work plan that PSCOB has for the coming year. And so it's a little more challenging. So the HRC went through this in a similar fashion, but there wasn't a budget already where the HRC is a part of the inclusion office budget. And so, that's something to think about. Maybe it's $5,000, $10,000 set aside for the different events that PSCOB is planning on doing and marketing materials. And then the auditor can kind of assess that after year one and adjust. But I think that's going to be really hard to guess what they would need.
So the discussion on the floor is, from what I'm hearing, is maybe part-time monitor position as the workload increases, go to full-time.
I mean, I think it's kind of, it's insecure to just hire a part-time person. If we anticipate that the workload for this position will be part-time, I'd rather see it be someone who's a full-time within that office who has duties in addition to PSCOB. I just feel like we're not going to get somebody who's going to stick around very long if we are only hiring part-time.
Okay.
We want somebody who's going to be around and it's going to be one of those things that needs some institutional memory at some point.
I think Commissioner Hammond has a good point too. We can always do a budget adjustment. Go ahead and get Gavin, get his office up and running, see what the workload is going to be, and then if you feel like, hey, we may need to have a full-time person, we can make an budget adjustment or put it in the budget for next year. So.
And, that position could be expanded if there's somebody who's, half-time PSCOB, half-time other operational analysis duties. And we see that PSCOB does have a really heavy workload, then maybe they expand to full-time PSCOB and we look into hiring another position within operational analysis.
I think we ought to move it forward to the mayor commission with the recommendation that the internal auditor's office will be the one responsible for the auditor monitor or whatever the monitor position. Let Gavin get his office established because Gavin's he'll be the one going to the meetings at the beginning anyway until somebody's hired. So let him get his office established and he can come back to us and say whether or not the workload justifies having another management analysis. I mean, that's the way to move it forward. Just seeing because the audit committee hasn't met to lay out Gavin's work plan just yet, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So let's see what his work plan is going to look like, and then if this is adding more of a workload to him, then he can come back and tell us. But at least let's get moving on placing this responsibility under the internal auditor, and then go from there.
Okay. Would like to make a motion? Gotta make a motion.
Make a motion that we move forward with what Commissioner Handy said to get the auditor's office up and running.
And just
And
as they determine their staffing needs, he can come back to us and make a recommendation about what he needs or doesn't need after he sees what his work plan is gonna be and what this position also, their work is gonna be.
So is that inclusive of both personnel funding and operating funding then? So the GOC report will just be assigning the work, no funding at this point?
And no funding at this point until he tells us, until he sees what the work is gonna entail for his office.
And he can come back with an agenda on that.
Right.
Right, a second.
wait a second.
I'll second.
All in favor? Moving on.
All right, so next up, as many of y'all probably remember, there was a parklet moratorium instituted, and the moratorium runs out on September 19th. And so staff has been working on kind of what lessons we've learned from the current policy, the current parklet policy. So this is one of those GOC policies that's come back. Yes,
Real quick. So we were discussing bathrooms, but we had to put that on hold because we have this deadline coming up. And we're taking July off and then, so that's why we're doing.
exactly, Chair. So we wanted to bring forward with the moratorium running out in September, just to kind of think back on timeline. In order to have a new policy before the moratorium runs out, we needed to talk about it this meeting, so that y'all have time to think about it over your break. And then if you do have consensus to move forward with some of our recommendations, we can start that work now, so that by September 19th, there's a new policy. So this gives us the opportunity to still meet one more time with y'all to talk about this, if you have any other further follow-up, because we do need approval at the September voting meeting. So we need to have something in that August-September cycle. And so we wanted to make sure we had at least 2 opportunities to talk to y'all, since you're going to be out, there's no GOC in July. So with that, we sent you a draft. Andrew and his team have taken a crack at some of our lessons learned. We wanted to walk through some of those lessons with y'all. We made edits in line in the policy, and we're prepared to talk through those with y'all, and think we have some good ideas to move this forward.
Thank you. So quick update. Since the ordinance was adopted, we received 4 applications. 2 have since been fully permitted. That would be South Kitchen and Thai Spoon. 1 remains underway, that's Trapeze, and then 1 has withdrawn, and that would be the National. So we view those in light of the moratorium as being grandfathered in, i.e. when Trapeze meets current code, they would receive the permit that they've applied for. But we have not accepted additional permits since the moratorium, or applications since the moratorium came in. There's a number of things that we have as lessons learned. I'll kind of talk about them big picture, and then if you want, we can go through the ordinance edits. I know that the attorney's office has had some additional feedback to share, and so if it's appropriate, Chair, maybe they can just chime in as we reach those relevant sections. So when we look at lessons learned, quite frankly, we didn't really anticipate that people would build decks to the degree that they have and that they would be so prominent. So we spent a lot of time thinking about barriers for safety, but didn't think about having that elevation and the prominence within those spaces. Within those barriers, we've also run into a challenge of kind of our traditional barrier, which is perhaps the least exciting, would be what they call Jersey barriers, those big cement barriers you'd see in a highway or road setting, versus your more customized barriers like we've actually seen our applicants use, either integrated in with their parklet decks or put along the perimeter. Staff have continued to struggle with how do we verify the safety when we maybe don't hold that training and knowledge in-house. Special events, so we're calling back that this parklet program started during a pandemic where we were really trying to push any kind of social and economic gathering outside. That language included some language around special events, but as we moved to an ordinance, it carried forward. But at this point, we're going to recommend some clarity around that. There's a kind of a housekeeping measure around violations. It's right as it's referenced now. It's probably a little more cumbersome than we would recommend. Revisiting bike lanes as they integrate near parklets, and then anchoring, specifically what items are not allowed to be anchored into the right of way. And so if there aren't any immediate questions, we could maybe start by going through the proposed edits.
Or we could just not do parklets. That's an option too. Just throw that out there.
Well, you bring up a good point. Well, what was the reason, before we came on, and we already had this conversation, what was the reason initially? Did we get some recommendations or some comments from the businesses downtown?
Yes.
Can you give me a little bit of history about it?
So it really did start with the catalyst of the pandemic and trying to provide safer outdoor areas where people could enjoy a meal and support a business without public health implications. And then I think transitioned into a bit of a amenity, both for the businesses and the downtown environment. You know, we've seen a lot of diversity in parklets, but in general, they're nice, pleasant places that you would like to enjoy a meal or beverage. And Angel, I know, without getting into specifics, some of the applicants have indicated economic potential. So is it correct that you had one applicant that kind of mentioned that they were anticipating generating 6 figures of revenue from their parklets?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a economic potential for the adjacent businesses, much like we have with sidewalk cafes.
And that's what I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to think what's sort of the difference though. And I know what we got out here right now in Washington, I think it's Washington Street, was somebody, the Trapeze building.
Mhm.
Okay, so what we got there. So I'm trying to see what's sort of the difference though then.
So sidewalk cafes are attached and immediately contiguous to a building, which actually gives them a clearer path to compliance with alcohol ordinances, as I understand. Parklets offer a couple of alternatives. One is they offer generally more space. So a parking space is a fairly uniform size, whereas sidewalk cafes in some areas along Clayton Street and elsewhere, you just fully lack the space in which you could have a cafe or a functional cafe. The other would be kind of that lateral length. So with a sidewalk cafe, you're going to be limited to the building face. With parklets, there's options for 2, 3, or 4 parking spaces. So it's really just kind of leveraging on that space. Now it comes at the expense of on-street parking and of course associated on-street parking revenues, to which ADDA reports that we average around $25,000 a year of gross revenue per downtown parking space. So it was just that trade-off. And I know when the committee addressed this before, one of the discussions was limiting the number of parklets within any given block so that you didn't completely shift that balance in favor of one over the other, and that is in the ordinance now.
Can I clarify, did you say 25,000? 2,500
1,000,
per spot?
yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I thought, for some reason I thought it was 100, I apologize.
So I think the only reason I bring that up is, staff is operating under the assumption y'all want to continue the parklet program. And so this policy was gratiated based on that assumption. But it is still up to y'all if you want to do that, knowing what we know now. We don't have to continue a parklet program, but if we do, here's how we would recommend changing it as there is a.
Okay, if you, like I always tell people, if you get it and then you take it away, it's gonna be.
Yeah, I want to continue it. I mean,
I just want to make sure there's agreement
It's
before.
been a thing in other cities for years, long before the pandemic. Chicago, Asheville, Greenville, yeah. There are other cities, San Francisco, I think, they've been doing it for years.
So just throwing that, there's an alternative. This is not something we have to do. But with that, Andrew, yeah, if you want to start moving through the policy draft.
So we use the traditional gray shade edit. So this is probably this is a proposed addition of areas that are ineligible for parklets. So we focused before, of course, on GDOT rights of way. We don't have the ability to issue that. Areas with speeds in excess of 25 miles an hour. Again, kind of that safety. And we do recommend, again, that you reconsider bike lanes. So there was a lot of consternation about this before because we had an active parklet adjacent to a bike lane. And specifically, that was the National on Hancock. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you could design around that. And to be frank with you, it's in the ordinance. It's not great. but it's there. The tools are there if you'd like to pursue it. When the National pursued it, it was a struggle, both from a design and a permitting standpoint, to the point that they agreed to, or they indicated they were withdrawing their application. And so there is no parklet in that area now, or we don't have any parklet applications or permits for areas adjacent to bike lanes, and Public Works and Central Services would continue to recommend to you that probably best to leave those off limits. Scrolling down. So this is again another housekeeping measure. There was a reference to kind of grandfathering in areas that had had a parklet under the emergency ordinance. That's fine, but that's all sunset. We're good now, so we can take that out of code. Okay, scrolling down here to section J. So during an application, what we're really proposing is two options on barriers, perimeter barriers. Jersey barriers, which don't have to be plain. They could be encased within some kind of design element or incorporated in, but we know that they can resist crashes. Or a barrier as designed and approved by a certified engineer, a licensed engineer, who would then, say that this can resist 250 pounds of force. That's where our review staff have really had to come to that clarity, because we didn't want to just say it only had to be Jersey barriers and kind of have, take that creativity off the table. I will say for the more formal parklets, so specifically South Kitchen and Trapeze, they've given us pretty close to a full plan set on what the design will be. And so, yes, there would be an expense to having to get an engineer, but it does provide them the idea that they can bring a lot of their own design creativity to a site. So if they were pursuing that, we would ask that that be a part of the application. Timing of permits, we talked about 2 weeks. We're, shall to should. Again, there's a lot of departments that are involved. You have fire, you have police, public works, central services. So this is kind of falling in line with how we would permit any development plan review with a multi-department review.
Real quick, before we move on, can I just make a comment on that subsection I?
Sure.
So the only comment that we had from the attorney's office on this, and I apologize, Andrew and his team got this to us way in advance, and it was just unfortunately we weren't able to review it earlier. But we just would suggest adding some additional language to clarify what we are looking for from an engineer to verify that they have approved it. In other words, is a letter that just says, I'm an engineer and I've approved this, is that sufficient? Is that what we want? Or do we actually want maybe an affidavit or specifically a more formalized plan? And we also wanted to add some language essentially saying, as provided by a later section that we're going to get to in just a minute, where it details a little bit more of what they're supposed to do. So those are just some small things that we would like to include just to make it a little bit clearer when staff are reviewing these requests in the future as to what the mayor and commission would like us to see from the engineers.
So an engineering plan, what's the difference from that and the affidavit?
Sure. So maybe to give you an example, I think a genuine question that happened when South Kitchen Bar's platform was being developed is, how could staff determine that is going to be able to withstand 250 pounds of pressure in all directions or force all directions? And so we may have a plan, but that plan, my knowledge, doesn't say anywhere this can withstand 250 pounds of pressure. And so, what we certainly could have potentially got from that engineer is a letter that just says, yep, I think this will withstand 250 pounds of pressure, but that's very informal. So an affidavit, I think, would put them on, a little bit more notice of the seriousness of that. But I'm also not opposed to just being something that's in the plan, as long as it's something that's drafted by the engineer that they're willing to stand behind, because we have just no way to measure that ourselves.
And I think we could give them the flexibility of either a plan that is designed and stamped by that engineer, which is their, verification, or an affidavit. So for example, if a landscape architect or even the business owner themselves draws up a plan and an engineer looks at that and says, yep, I've done the math, or I know that it'll, meet or exceed 250 pounds of force, you're good. And then what we would ask later on is that once the item is built, that same individual would verify through an affidavit that, yes, it does meet the design intent.
I think that would be acceptable. But obviously it's up to you all as to what level of, requirement you want to impose so that you would feel comfortable that, the platform or whatever it is that's built meets what your expectations are.
From your standpoint, which one do you, tempting the government, which one you feel more safe? Affidavit?
I think either is fine, as you just said, because, we rely on those stamped documents, for instance, in all of our planning and zoning matters, so I think that's fine. I think that we just wanted to have something a little bit more formal than just for instance, an email.
And just to clarify, like the affidavit is like a sworn court statement.
Yeah.
So we could,
Okay.
I agree with you, Chair, said both of them have value.
Just hypothetically, just hypothetically, if the engineer who originally did the plan could not stamp off on the plan once these things have been, does it disqualify them from receiving a parklet, or does it, or do they have to go back to the drawing board? That's my question, makes sense.
I mean, I can speak to that a little bit, because if they sign off on the plan permit application, that's their conveyance of intent that the design will meet when constructed correctly. But if they go out there and see that it's not constructed correctly, so maybe the engineer specified a certain size lag bolt or a certain bolt pattern, and they get out there and it's just nails, well, then they would say, well, I can't sign off on this. I can't verify that this will meet it. At that point, they don't have like a failed application. What we would say is, we can't give you the permit now. You need to work with your engineer to either revise your plans or design, build to the design so that the engineer can sign off. So the engineer would become both on the design and review side.
I think it's safe to say we can agree to add either or, that language.
And it'll come up one more time, I believe. Okay, so scrolling down a bit more. So here in the design, we talk about items not anchored in the street. This is covered in barriers, but again, with these kind of broader, more prominent decks, there was anchoring into the street, which was allowed by the ordinance, but maybe wasn't in line with the intent. So what we're clarifying is you can't anchor anything unless it's otherwise identified, and the only thing identified that could be anchored would be an ADA ramp. So something that's meant to provide enhanced accessibility.
So the terminology anchored, they bolted something in the ground?
In that case, I think they drilled in and put rebar in and then set into the rebar. But yes, they drilled into public infrastructure.
We had that in the original language.
We had it in the plan, so I mean, it was consistent with the ordinance, and so any attempt to deny it.
And so the essence here is these things aren't supposed to be permanent.
Right.
Yeah.
When you begin drilling into right of way, you become very permanent, and that is not something that was ever intended.
Right.
Which is why it's a lesson learned.
So then changing section E from just barriers to barriers and platforms. Again, this speaks to the kind of those platforms, decks that have been created. And so we spent some significant time on this. There is somewhat of a functional need to consider a platform, especially on Lower Washington and Lower Clayton, where you get a very steep grade drop. So we actually went into GIS and looked at elevations, and across 2 parking spaces, which is the minimum allowed by a parklet, the most grade that we can capture is a fall of 24 inches. And so what we're recommending is a kind of a split in that we would allow your surface, your foot surface, so to speak, your floor height to be at 16 inches. Now, why 16 inches? That's 12 inches plus some room for a wooden runner underneath to hold it all together. So the idea being, if you were doing 2 spaces in the most extreme spot of downtown, you could have about a 1-foot deck that's level, and then you'd have a step down and you'd have another 1-foot deck. And that would provide that nice level space. But if you're not, so, quite frankly, South Kitchen could have done it without a deck. They chose to use a deck. This would not prevent them from using a deck in the future, but it would bring down that height. Additionally, we recommend some language around railings adjacent to where vehicles are. So the original ordinance had language about barrier minimum and maximum heights. Well, once they used that deck as a barrier, they then triggered ADA, which does require railings above a certain height. So in that case, former interim director Hassemer, in my opinion, correctly signed off and said yes, even though the total height is high, as you got two overlapping areas of code here. What we're recommending is that if you're elevated more than 6 inches adjacent to where vehicles are present, that a railing would be required. Now, if you're curb adjacent, it's not required. One thing to remember is the curb's gonna be 6 inches anyhow. So you're looking at kind of a maximum of a 10-inch drop between the highest point and the adjacent, and it's a shall, not a should. So there's nothing that would prevent a designer from having a railing adjacent to the sidewalk. We just wouldn't require it as a minimum part of code.
And so if I can just chime in here, that was one of my questions, was just whether we should require it, like whether we're comfortable with the idea of, say, a ramp that's going up and whether there's a risk, say someone using a wheelchair. So I think you made a great point about the fact that it's already going to be 6 inches from the curb. So as that goes up to that 16 meters, if someone were to fall off that ramp, is that something we want to require? There needs to be a railing, or are we comfortable leaving it to them to make that decision in compliance with whatever ADA requirements are?
No, put that railings.
Okay. I mean, we could just say anything in excess of 6 inches would require a railing and not have the adjacent to areas where vehicles are present.
Candy, Link, any thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I think the ramp would depend on how high the ramp is, like a little ramp just going up to a curb. But if they're going up to like 12 or 16 inches, it might need something.
Okay.
I'm not real sure why we're allowing decks anyway. I mean, that's not a temporary thing. And, some of the sidewalk cafes, I mean, we have a sidewalk that slants. So, that's just something they ought to do. I don't know why we're considering that.
Yeah, once you were going to near the finish, I was gonna bring that up.
Sure. This is optional. I mean, this is where we're looking for your feedback. We could absolutely just say that decks and platforms are not allowed. And then you would not see a recreation of any form of what's been happening with the two in question. We were trying to strike that middle ground, especially looking at kind of the most extreme cases where there's a leveling effect. But again, like you say, there's plenty of sidewalk cafes that don't have that effect.
Right.
I don't really have a problem with decks. I mean, I kind of think that 16 inches is a little high even, but establishing that space, I don't know, I mean, it's common in other communities for that parklets, you see them. But I mean, I do think that, setting a limit on the height is definitely necessary, and I would say that 16 inches is even a little tall.
Well, I can actually think of one area where a deck would make some sense, and that would be to limit it at 6 inches so that you have an equal transition from the curb to the parklet. But that would be 6 inches, uniform, not.
Mm-hmm.
If the road falls 6 inches, your deck falls 6 inches, 8 inches or whatever, it would still be parallel to whatever the road grade is, but it would allow for that even transition on and off the curb.
To me, just aesthetically, you see these parklets, they got the nice little planters or whatever. You just see this wood with just. When we had envisioned the parklet program, I never thought to see that. So when I did see it, I was like, wow, that's interesting.
It's pretty.
So.
How tall is trapeze?
I think they go up to 30 inches. It's quite extreme.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how, 16 would not be as intrusive as that.
I think that's kind of feedback we need, Chair, though. If that's something you want to see struck from this, we could go back, bring a draft to you in the next.
Maybe.
That's just my opinion. It's open.
I'm thinking, like me, I feel like, the thing that's so jarring about that is that it's, at its highest level, it's above eye level. So maybe we use language that dictates that at no place should the railing be above, I don't know, 4 feet or something. So they would have to calculate the floor of the deck based on how high the legal railing would be.
Are they gonna use,
Kind of like fencing around your house, around your front yard, you're not allowed to have fence more than 4 feet.
for the railing, is it gonna be wood there, the same wood, or is it gonna be the metal?
I think we would allow either as it's written now. It would just have to be consistent with kind of an ADA design.
So how will that railing, if it's wood, more than likely it's gonna be nailed in, but if it's the metal barriers,
It's gonna be anchored in.
I mean, so if you're gonna do the railing, it would be anchored to the deck.
Yeah.
Right? So even if it's metal, you could use lag screws or bolts to deal with it. That is another minor advantage of even a low deck, is it gives you something to anchor into. So if you're going to do a custom barrier that's not a Jersey barrier, a deck lends itself to maybe a little bit more of a robust design. But again, we had parklets for almost 24 months with no provision for such a measure, and people made it work.
And another reason this is in front of the GOC again is special events, right? Now, thinking about special events, if there's decks, it's very hard, even if they're saying this isn't permanent, to ask someone to move a deck. And so obviously, right, the decks that are built right now are not moving, for a special event, unless they're taking them apart. So, that's one reason to think about maybe moving away from decks, is that then there's not that challenge of having to actually move a deck.
So let's think about it this way. We have the Christmas parade and it passes one of the decks. Actually passed both of those decks. So that's where people gather to see, the floats and stuff. But that's just my opinion, we're a group of 5 and it's just kind of disruptive to me, but
I think the height aspect is disruptive. I mean, at the lower level, I don't think it's as jarring, but yeah, that one at West Washington feels like a whole building's plopped down in the middle of the street.
Well, a lower one's gonna feel the same way.
I mean, not necessarily if it's, if you can actually see up and into. I mean, part of the whole reason behind parklets is to have that vibrant kind of street side socialization, and that's, having a big tall railing defeats the purpose of that.
Yeah, and I think because the Athens-Clarke County has been thriving for so many years, I don't think that type of social life will stop if we don't have parklets, or nor will it increase because we have parklets. But you was gonna say something?
yeah.
I was just gonna mention while we were talking about special events, I mean, even if we use the Jersey barriers, those are gonna be too difficult to move for special events. They're really heavy, and the businesses would probably have to get like a huge piece of equipment in here to move it. So that's something to consider too, if you want the parklets or not, if they're in the way of special events.
I don't see them moving for special events, and I don't necessarily think they have to. But yeah, I mean, maybe we explore language that addresses the overall height rather than the deck height itself.
I would, maybe I can suggest this. We've seen decks at their most, grandiose phase. I still have a gut reaction that it shouldn't be a requirement, but we do have a requirement for ADA level access so that everybody can equal this. Maybe what we say is that decks and platforms can be no higher than the curb. And so at that point, you're getting more or less an extension of that, and that's something that staff could monitor. And if we see the pendulum swung too far the other way, then we could bring it back to the mayor and commission for consideration. But I would say either do that or take them off the table. The 16 inches really was, as we kind of did the math, that is that lower limit of what you can really build in order to come up with a level platform. Otherwise, you're coming into too many steps within your steeper areas.
So maybe it's a certain level from the curb rather than overall level.
Well, let me see, what other changes do you have? But Andrew, tell me where you get through this. There is a limitation on how many parkers can be on a block, right?
Correct.
What is that limitation?
It's based on percentage of spaces, 30% of spaces total for a block face.
I mean,
We did that because each block's different.
yeah, so for Clayton Street, I mean, for total Clayton Street.
I think there's 120 spaces on Clayton.
Yeah, but it depends on block by, we do it block by block, so it depends on how many parking
It could
spaces
be,
on that block.
you would not generally see more than 2 parklets per block maximum density. Some blocks would perhaps be capped at even just 1 2-space parklet. If you'd like, I'd be happy to kind of run some quick calculations for y'all and for maybe the whole commission to consider that shows the spaces available.
Yeah, not that I disagree, I'm not disagreeing with parklets, but when we started to talk about $25,000 a space, that pays for something we may need.
Yeah.
Sure. So this next section is proposed to address special events. Again, we had some language from when it was in an emergency ordinance around giving preference to special events. We've certainly seen special events come back to an extremely high level, perhaps the highest level we've ever seen. Seems like almost every weekend is booked with something. Our recommendation is that we not have a language that says that references special event. There is still in what would be revised section 3, the ability for the manager to require parklet materials come up for the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So if we saw some kind of race where it extended into where the parking would normally be, well, in that case, we'd say, you can't impinge the spot, we're gonna need it to come up. The most likely place that we see it, and this happens now, is if we have some very socially charged rallies, marches, we saw it with the Black Lives Matter, George Floyd things. We would actually go around even to sidewalk cafe owners and say, hey, by Friday at noon, your stuff's gotta be inside. And that was really about taking things that could be loose or easily weaponized out of that environment. And so we would suggest to you that we still have that flexibility with number 3, but by removing former number 2, it doesn't give special event permit holders or applicants a sense that they're going to be able to clear the landscape.
That makes sense.
Okay.
If I can add really quickly, that's also just consistent with how we do sidewalk cafes.
Yeah.
I just think it's important that we remain consistent.
So this is another housekeeping measure, and that's something the attorney's office asked about recently. This is about revocation and suspension of a permit, not appeal. So it's a little maybe cumbersome as it's currently written because as it's written now, it says that only the administrative hearing officer can suspend or revoke a permit. A very simple explanation of this would be what happens if somebody fails to maintain their insurance? Do we really want to run the 4 to 8 weeks it takes to get this in front of an administrative hearing officer before we can say, I'm sorry, you haven't renewed your insurance and your permit is suspended? So what we're proposing, and this is consistent with how sidewalk cafes and other things would operate, is that Central Services has the right to suspend or revoke a permit. And as further described below, the applicant has the right to appeal that through the administrative hearing officer. So we've not removed anybody's rights. We certainly wouldn't wield this necessarily, but we are saying, hey, there may be times where we've got to take that permit quickly. And you have the right to say that we did it wrong.
Who is the administrative hearing, or who would that person be?
It's Murphy's.
Okay,
Okay.
okay.
Like you judge,
Ignore the 20 seconds.
yeah.
And I think the only question I had is, I was concerned about removing that as an option, that the section E. I don't have any concerns with giving the authority of central services. Andrew, what do you think about changing E just to say central services then, instead of the AHO? Or central services and the AHO?
So I would say maybe revoked or suspended by central services and the AHO, subject to appeal from the through the AHO.
No, not that, for changing E. Because right now,
I think we felt like that was redundant with C.
I guess, but that still requires a 48 hours notice, C does, so.
Okay.
I guess my question is, can we imagine a situation where there would be such an immediate violation? And I agree, I don't think, insurance probably do want to give someone 48 hours to fix that. But is there something where we would want?
I mean, I don't have any problem if we leave that in reference, central services and the AHO. It gives us flexibility if needed.
That's what I think I would suggest.
We add that.
Sure.
So it would be, E would be by the central services department or the administrator.
And I think that could be it. Let's just quickly scroll down.
Let's go through the cost of this, since somebody's making that 36 figures. Maybe we need to look at the pricing.
So that is, well, it's in the schedule of ordinances.
I have another question too. So, you know, since the several, I don't know if anybody, I mean, it doesn't, the interest in this has it been that great?
So it's been about half of what it was when it was free. I think we had 7 or 8 permits at any given point when it was free through the pandemic. And once we applied the fee, we saw 4. We're aware of 1 more that's expressed interest, but they're currently waiting for the.
Really, the whole point of the park was for to give spaces to, you know, so that people could eat outside, but also those spaces that were very small inside. They would have some room, but there's obviously some places that are downtown that have a big old patio out back on the side or wherever. I mean, should that be factored into the eligibility of?
And Paloma Park is the other one that's interested in having one.
Yeah, and they've got a big
Yeah.
patio right next door.
So could that be put into the language if you already have outside seating? As well as, and I know that the parklets was because we were in COVID, and so this gives people safety to sit outside and eat. Well, now that we went past that and you have ample space inside as well as space outside, shouldn't that disqualify you from wanting to get a parklet, since we are saying parking spaces are where we receive revenue from, whereas with the parklet, not so much?
We receive revenue through their sales tax.
I'm saying, is it as much as this individual parking spot though?
Yeah, I kind of agree that if a business has outside space beyond sidewalk space, maybe they shouldn't qualify for this
Yeah.
program.
Like Boris had.
Well, that's what I was gonna clarify
Yeah.
to her, was that we do have sidewalk cafes, so that would still be allowed.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if they have space on their
Other than
property
that.
beyond, if they do have space on their property that's outdoor, then maybe this could just.
What'd you think, Andrew?
I think if we're gonna draw that line, saying with on the property, probably is a clear boundary. Specifically, that's gonna catch Paloma Park, that's gonna catch Slash Resort, that's gonna catch, you know, like, of course, that would be eligible because they're a bar. There's probably a few more I can't think of off the top of my head. You know, it may actually catch somebody like Clocked, who has had a parklet in the past, but has shown us no interest in pulling a permit under the ordinance. So yeah, I mean, if you wanted to try to level the playing field a little bit that way and further limit it, I think you could add that in.
So that discriminate, so that's my, that's a discrimination. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that's why, yeah, y'all pay, a legal pay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure that it gets started, gets restaurants.
So what I'll say is, if we're gonna start getting into this idea where we're treating some establishments differently from others, we need to be able to articulate a rational basis for doing so.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that would implicate legal protection clause. Like discrimination. Yes, sir.
I mean, I could see the rationale being that there's only a limited amount of space that we allow for these, and we should save that for businesses that really need it.
The alternative you could look at is the fire marshal seating capacity that's licensed to a business, and you could try to draw some logical point there. You know, perhaps we could, if you wanted to extend the moratorium another period or so, we could bring back that information, maybe even without the business names associated with it. You could just kind of say, well,
I think we ought to think about all the possibilities of what could happen, and I mean, obviously, this is why we're here today, to be things that would anchor something into the paper.
So the only thing I can add to that is I think you could establish a rational basis here, perhaps using an objective factor like that to differentiate between applicants. Like, you know, if we have two applicants who both want to parklet on the same area, we want to preference that one. I'm not entirely sure I feel good about a rational basis to just entirely, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I guess that would be something we should consider. Would you want to just entirely disqualify? Like, there's only one applicant, but they've got a lot of space. They cannot have a parklet, and therefore there will not be a parklet on this section of the street because of their size? Or are you really only interested in it when you're comparing two applicants?
My concern is when you have applicants who already have significant outdoor space beyond the right-of-way adjacent sidewalk space, and they might want to expand out into the park, it feels like they're taking over a whole block. And it's also eliminating the opportunity for a smaller business to take advantage of the parklets because we only allow 30% of the street front to be parklet.
For the block.
Well, and they do impact the business downtown. I mean, you know, again, I'm fine with parklets, but that does take away a potential, maybe a customer for somebody that doesn't, a smaller shop or retail or something like that depends upon those spots.
So, really.
Probably, if the goal is to say we will not provide a parklet, even if there's no other applicants except for large entity X, because we want to hold that for a potential other business. I think we probably should think about that a little bit more and think about how we would articulate that. I mean, there may be better ways to articulate that, because you know, there's no benefit, there's not insufficient benefit to HC Gov to give up the parking spot, you know, or something along those lines.
In my mind, the whole purpose of the parklet program is to increase the amount of outdoor dining space and give more businesses the opportunity to take advantage of outdoor dining spaces. When you have a business that already has a huge privately owned outdoor dining space, they don't necessarily need to take advantage of this parklet program.
You give me an example. I don't eat downtown a lot.
Do I what?
Can you give me an
Ted's has a nice big outdoor dining space. Paloma Park has that space. The Last Resort converted their parking lot to it. You know, those are businesses that have, I mean, they probably have more outdoor space than indoor space, quite frankly. I mean, I'm someone who prefers to eat outdoors. I have ear issues, so the Echo is in the indoor dining areas, and I always prefer to eat in an outdoor space. So it allows more businesses to cater to customers like me.
Maybe we can let Andrew stew on that one and come back.
yeah, certainly I'd like to come back with the attorney's office having a deeper thought about rational nexus. So
Yeah, my concern, just if I could, if we are coming back to us, maybe come back to us with a different cost structure or permitting fee structure. And then also, and I think it's in here somewhere, you know, when it gets cold out and it's winter out, I mean, these things are gonna be sitting there and no one's gonna be inside. So, I mean, I don't, you know, for you know, the business closes during the summer months, or you see where I'm going. I mean, we don't want.
So this, just to give you an understanding what the current lay of the land is, current cost $500 per quarter for the first 2 spaces, $500 for each additional space. They can permit, so they pull a permit once a year, but they can permit just certain quarters. If they just said, look, I just want this for fall football and summer, they can have it for that space and then they can take it up and that saves them their fees and it also frees up that parking for, parking or other uses.
But because they have to be so significant now
Right.
with these heavy jersey barriers and stuff, most of them are not gonna wanna pull them up.
Right.
Yeah,
Because then they have to store them somewhere. So it's probably cheaper and easier for them just to pay the fee to keep them up. It feels pretty low.
the fee.
Do you all have a sense of where you would recommend a fee? I mean,
It's on a percentage, right? We came up with it.
so I think we looked at what we would charge if it was a sidewalk cafe, if I recall correctly. And then there was it went a little bit further when it went to spaces 3 and 4 because the body at the time was trying to not incentivize everybody to go grab 4 spaces.
So 500 a quarter, what is that a percentage of for the revenue that's typically generated?
It's 25,000 a month,
Quick math.
About 25,000 a year.
a year, sorry. It would be nice.
So it's about a little less than 10%.
50,000 for 2 spaces.
And with like South Bar and Trapeze, they're gonna add an additional, 10, 15 tables out there.
Yeah, I mean, that would be on the high end.
It's, I mean,
Yeah.
to rent a space that would allow you to do that would be a lot more cost associated with it.
Okay,
2,000.
so look at it,
The way to look at it, they're renting, public property.
yeah. So look at our high cost.
4%.
And
Can we go back to the structure? Land something with these decks? You know, ideas. So just lower it. You got 2 options. Go to 16 inches or have it at grade a sidewalk.
so 16 inches maximum height, a maximum height equal to the sidewalk, or just say, no, it's just the only thing that you can have structure-wise would be either your barrier or your ADA access.
With the 2 applicants already existing, would that be grandfathered in?
No, and so that's something we wanted to share with you all, is whatever changes you recommend, these permits are through a calendar year. So staff would view each new year as a new permit, a new application. So unless we were told otherwise and it was affirmed by the commission, we would say whatever the permitting regime is in 2024, everybody plays by that rule, regardless of how you got your permit in 2023. Now, certainly my recommendation to you all is if we intend to go that route as recommended, the earlier we can communicate that to those businesses, the more time they'll have to adjust.
See, I'd have to think about that. Doing that to them.
Yeah.
That would be, because they did follow the rules. But then we're going to change the rules, which I get just because we don't keep people having anchor things, but based on saying that.
I mean, I don't know with the decks themselves, because I can see how they have, they help with the, where you might have uneven pavement, or, allow stormwater to drain out, you might have puddles in places. But yeah, I feel like the overall height, when you add the rails on top of a 16-inch deck, that's when it gets really intrusive. So,
Well, Chair, maybe they can bring some of these
Yeah.
back to us. It's obviously it's going to take a few, maybe also give Americans that we may need to extend the moratorium a bit longer.
I think y'all have to at this meeting, right?
Yeah, we have to do it at this meeting.
So,
And we could vote in August to extend.
yeah, so September 19th is the moratorium, so we still have one more cycle, so July, August, we could have hit it all, one before, but you got the August GOC meeting, so we're gonna have to talk about this in August.
Maybe we don't, I'm just trying to
Sure.
be prepared in case we do.
And so Chair, what I have to come back to y'all with is reviewing the density by block and just kind of showing you how many spaces in any given area could be eligible. Maybe provide some options on pricing. Consider if we need to make availability universal to those outside dining or with a certain size. Whether or not to grandfather in current permit holders through future years, and then maybe a little further clarity on deck height.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll have that in August for y'all when we get back. So the last topic,
Tear it down.
Yeah.
Just kind of.
if time allows, is the leasing policy. So Chair, did you want to?
We only leasing. Is there a deadline for leasing?
So there's a deadline, it's later than the moratorium, the deadline is, y'all extended current leases through December, right?
We can talk about this later.
Yeah.
If y'all want to, we can hold on, but you have some, the two options y'all asked for, we've sent them to you, so you have something to look at, and when we come back, we think could be an easy decision for y'all, to make, so.
Okay.
I'll make a motion to hold this until later.
Yes.
I'll second.
All right, I'm favor.
And
So please review the email that we sent out last Thursday, so we can, possibly move on that in August. The last thing is, the biggest one. I need one more motion.
motion to adjourn.
Well, can we set up?
Oh, yeah, we need to talk about,
Tell us what works for you.
Well, okay, so I can come on Mondays at 1 if these are planned a couple
Mondays at 1
months
it
in
is.
advance, and I can make arrangements at 1.
so for me, Mondays at 1 is perfect for me.
I mean, I can make it work, I just have to know, like, far in advance and coordinate with my coworkers.
For the next 3 years, it'll be Monday at 1.
Two,
So next one will be the 21st of August, is that right?
yeah,
If we continue with the third Monday.
third
So
Monday.
we wanna stick with the third Monday?
That you don't have.
And then we'll just plan on that in September and October.
Okay, well, we'll let them know that we're in with the third Monday.
Only for now.
By the time.
Yeah, you're asked that.
Yeah. I'll fix it.
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
Um,
All opposed?
Thanks, y'all.